Hello, everybody. This is a tradition I've been doing for a couple of years now. Every year for the last 5 years, I've attended the Pork Fest, the Porcupine Freedom Festival, up in northern New Hampshire. Probably the biggest single event of the Free State Project, and perhaps, depending on how you measure it, the largest libertarian event in the world. And typically, I will make follow-up video afterwards, kind of explaining what it was like. And this year is going to be no different. I actually had one of my subscribers actually ask that I do this, and I am happy to do so. So. Uh, as I said, this is the fifth time I've gone to PorcFest, and it's very difficult to separate in a review your personal experiences and stories, how things went for you, versus objectively assessing the entire event. You can try and do that, and you can try and be as objective as possible, but whether something is a successful event or not, often the rubrics to determine that are quite difficult. So I will say that I had a great time. I have a lot of friends that I have only really see at PorcFest. It's always great to see them. I have other friends that maybe I've known online but never met in person. And it's always a great experience to meet someone that maybe you've known remotely for a long time and actually meet them in person. And many of my subscribers on here I have met in previous PorcFests, and I met several new subscribers at this PorcFest, including one from as far away as Sweden. And slightly ironically, I got my big uptick in Swedish subscribers while I was at PorcFest 3 years ago. I was there and I checked my email and I had something like 10 or 12 messages, and they were new subscribers that had all subscribed from the anarcho-capitalist Facebook group in Sweden. And I met one of those guys this time, which is also great. It's kind of a funny experience. You'll be doing your own thing and somebody will kind of approach you and you kind of see this recognition on their face, and they'll come and sometimes they'll know exactly who I am, and sometimes I'll just look familiar, but that's always fun. It was good to see friends. It was good to make new friends. I had a nice time. It's a beautiful area. Uh, you know, uh, you know, in that regard, I can't say that I had a bad time, but I will say that in terms of an event, it seemed disappointing this year. And I'm not the only person to have voiced that opinion. And it's a tricky thing to pin down why that is. There's a couple of reasons that might be, um, but it definitely felt, if in the past every PorcFest people would say this is the biggest event that it's been, it's bigger and better every year. This is the first year where nobody was saying that. I didn't hear anybody say, "Oh yeah, this PorcFest, it's bigger and better than any previous PorcFest." I heard lots of people, and this is my own personal opinion, say that it wasn't as good this year. That it was actually seemed like a considerable decrease, both in terms of the number of people who were there, the number of vendors, but in the quality of the speakers, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to try and parse this out. There is actually some worthwhile intellectual discussion to be had about PorcFest, because I think a big part of the problem was an ideological schism, a personal ideological schism that has occurred within the Free State Project, which has been manifested at PorcFest. Um, and I'll analyze that in a little bit. So one thing I want to say is, normally when you go to PorcFest, you meet all these friends, you have a lot of you make new friends, you have a lot of interesting discussions and conversations, say around the campfire, around the picnic tables, walking around. There's a lot of smart people who go to PorcFest who have lots of different experiences, and it's great to get to meet them and interact with them. But ostensibly, PorcFest is a festival with lots of speakers. People come and give presentations on a wide range of topics, and these range from overtly libertarian political things that could range from, what's the LP doing, to eminent domain or asset forfeiture or the war on drugs, or even legal theories, um, how to fight a parking ticket, and then there's a very strong kind of um, localist, survivalist uh, element in here. So you'll have people giving lectures on how to gun safety, or how to build an AR-15, or how to do beekeeping. Last year there was a really interesting discussion that I watched about beekeeping, and this year, and this is kind of, sorry to say this, but one of the most interesting things I saw was a lecture on growing mushrooms, not psychedelic mushrooms, but edible mushrooms. Um, and that's great, and I don't mind that these events happen at PorcFest. They're actually kind of refreshing to have a choice between, you know, hardcore politics and honey. It's nice that you can choose those, and actually, the honey and the mushrooms are actually things that might be practical for some people. But what is disconcerting is that the quality and interest of the lectures has gone way down. Now, that's hard to assess. You know, it's definitely a case that the more you go, the more you've heard, the harder it is to find something that's interesting. If you've already heard lectures about, the Second Amendment, or Bitcoin, then it's not that interesting to hear that stuff again and again and again. And that doesn't mean that necessarily the lectures are worse. They could be just as good, or they may even be better. And it's just I, as an observer, am less interested or less, drawn to that than I would have been otherwise. So I have to admit that that's a possibility. But up to this point, there always have been a host of speakers that I go, oh, that person would be really interesting to hear, and I want to go see their thing. So I'm talking, probably the biggest names, David Friedman. All his stuff, I think he came at least two of the times that I went. All his stuff was very interesting, very lively debates. You have Bob Murphy, you have Joe Salerno, even Doug French, Ben Powell. Dan D'Amico gave a whole lot of really interesting talks the first or second year that I went. Michael Huemer came one of the years I went. That was amazing. Even though I'm a bit of a fanboy for him. Very interesting, thought-provoking lectures. We even had the first year I went, Stefan Molyneux, and everyone knows I'm not the biggest Stefan Molyneux fan, but at least it was interesting. At least we got it out in the open. Some of his reasoning. That's actually Stefan Molyneux essentially jumped the shark for me at PorcFest in 2013 or 14, whenever it was that I first saw him there. So there's been a lot of Boston Tea Party, also known as Kenneth Royce, a gun rights / libertarian author, one that I have read, I think, almost all of his books except for the ones about going on safari. He spoke. Bill Bupert. Yeah, lots of interesting people. This year, the main keynote speaker who was there all week was Jeffrey Tucker. Now, Jeffrey Tucker's been coming a couple years now, and I think Jeffrey Tucker just likes to come to PorcFest, and God bless him for that. He's a fun guy, it seems like. I never go out of my way to talk to celebritarians, so I didn't interact with him personally. He seems like a cool dude, but honestly, the stuff that he says is not particularly interesting, and that's not to detract from any contributions he may or may not have made about his books or whatever. But I listened to most of his speeches, and there wasn't a lot in them that I found that interesting. Again, is that just because it's me and because I've immersed myself in this stuff for a long enough time that the 101 level, stuff doesn't really do anything for me? Maybe, but I can't imagine that that's the best that they could do in terms of speakers. Jacob Hornberger was there, and I respect Jacob Hornberger, and he's a smart guy. But the basis of the talks was very, very elementary, at least the ones that I saw. There were several Reason people there. Matt Welch, gosh, I've seen Matt Welch now so many times, and it's just hard for him not to do anything that just becomes an autobiography about which papers he worked at and when. I watched an hour-long speech from him, and I took away one fact that I found interesting. I did see, oh, she's going to kill me if she sees this. The anti-war radio lady, Angela Keaton, who last I knew was married to Brian Doherty, who's a big libertarian author. I like Angela Keaton. She actually watches this channel sometimes and has messaged me. We've talked before at PorcFest. We didn't talk this time. Nothing against her. I thought she gave an interesting presentation. But another kind of way to measure the how interesting these debates, these presentations were, is the level of the questions and answers after. And the thing is, not many people were asking questions. The questions they asked were not very interesting. There's not a lot of back and forth, not a lot of debate or discussion or dialogue. It was a presentation would be given, and then one or two people, mostly who just want to get a chance to go up to the mic, would go up to the mic and give their piece. Not entirely and all the way, but to a certain extent. And I definitely did not see the first year or two that I was there, they would have these large panels of these really, really involved Bitcoin entrepreneurs, a lot of them who were free staters who then became Bitcoin barons. And those discussions were very heated, very thought-provoking, very interesting. And actually, they made me a ton of money because I bought a whole bunch of Bitcoin in 2012, which who knew that that was going to blow up the way that it did. Um, but nothing, but it was not just, I mean, they would talk about, does Bitcoin violate the regression principle? And could it replace the dollar as the reserve currency? And does it work in this scenario? And can it be attacked by this way? And can it be hacked? And can it blah, blah, blah. And fascinating, fascinating stuff. David Friedman had a debate with Bob Murphy, Chicago versus Austrian. Very interesting, worth watching. I uploaded a video actually just about that a couple years ago, whenever it was. Again, Friedman talked about polycentric legal orders. He talked about the Zir in Somalia and Icelandic. I've seen good lectures on Islam and libertarianism. Just did not see anything even remotely interesting. I found myself, no kidding, watching the main lectures, and I was watching on my phone instead videos of cats getting brain headaches from like licking ice cream, because honestly, that was more interesting than what was going on the stage most of the time. Again, is it me? Is it because my interests have shifted? Not not to say that my positions have changed, but like I'm just interested in certain things, and I hard impossible to say for sure what degree of what, but people were not attending these lectures as much. They weren't as big a deal. People weren't going and talking about them after. The side discussions you have with people are still fine, but there just aren't as many people. Um, the the organizers, I read some articles where they quoted that, well, this year is, quote, on par with previous years, which to me sounds like a dubious way of saying that it hasn't grown, which I think is true. I talked to some of the vendors. There are fewer vendors than I've seen in the past. Um, you're not going to starve at PorcFest. There are plenty of options for food and other materials, and nice shirts to wear, but not as many as there have been in the past. And talking to the vendors, even though there's fewer vendors, which if there's the same number of people means they should be doing more business, all the ones that I talked to said that they were doing considerably less business, that it was relative to the most recent few years much smaller. Now, of course, if you go back 10 years, yeah, it's way bigger than it was 10 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever, but it is not growing, or it didn't grow from last year, which is an impression a lot of people had. I don't know if they have exact numbers because it's a whole bunch of libertarians. A lot of people sneak in. A lot of people don't register. People register, maybe don't come, whatever. So uh, there's that. Um, Kind of the elephant in the room, if people have followed this really closely, is the one of the main fixtures of PorcFest, one of the main promoters of PorcFest, and indeed one of the main promoters of the Free State Project is the radio host Ian Freeman from Free Talk Live. Um, quite a influential figure in term, if for no other reason because of his media platform. He runs a very successful radio station, not just a YouTube channel or a podcast, which anyone can do. He makes money on the radio. I think he's on more than 100 stations. I don't listen to Free Talk Live. I did 5 or 6 years ago, but I no longer do. But I heard about PorcFest and the Free State Project largely because of Ian Freeman and Free Talk Live and Free Keene. And many people, the significance of his media outreach is such that many people actually um, completely associate Free Keene and Ian Freeman with the Free State Project as if they're one and the same. Now, granted, Ian Freeman is part of the Free State Project 100%, and so it would be wrong to deny that. But it's important to understand that him and his group of people, the so-called Keeniacs, much more the group of libertarian activists who are much more focused on civil disobedience than they are on political action or more subtle, less abrasive types of activism. And I'm not saying that to disagree with everything they've done, because I certainly don't. Um, there are about a dozen people in Keene, and there's 2,000 Free Staters who live in New Hampshire. Most of them live an hour away from Keene in Manchester in the Merrimack River Valley on the seacoast in Concord, and they don't behave in that way. And yeah, I've seen it many times on, say, Reddit, where people, oh, I don't believe in the Free State Project because I don't like Robin Hooding. Well, Robin Hooding is like three people in Keene. That's not everybody else. Now I'm not, I understand why people could make that mistake because they have such a huge platform. In any event, Ian was basically officially, I don't want to say that, what's the term, ostracized or kicked out of the Free State Project. Um, uh, this was done because ostensibly of his statements about the ethics and morality of um, basically the age of consent, that there isn't an age of consent. Ian had a girlfriend who was pretty young. We don't know when things started happening, when they didn't, but he lived with her. I think from the time she was 14, they had a long relationship. She's no longer with him. She's, I think, 18 or 19 at this point. But needless to say, they definitely had something going on um, that many people find pretty inappropriate. Um, what's more than that, and I got this from people who follow it more closely than I, he started relating stories from his own childhood about sexual experiences he had with other guys. Apparently, a neighbor who was, when he was 10, this neighbor was like 15, 16, would offer him video games, and in return, they would exchange sexual favors, and Ian has kind of made light of this. As if it was no big deal. I guess initially he was much more trepidatious about talking about it. Now he's much more open. Um, and that's why the Free State Project officially is shunning him, ostracizing him, refusing to associate with him. Um, what's interesting is the timing. The Free States Project goal is to get 20,000 libertarians from across the country and the world to move to New Hampshire. The way this would be done is by people to sign a pledge to move, and the idea being once 20,000 people had signed, that would trigger the move, and everyone who would sign would agree to move. So if only 3,000 people signed up, you wouldn't be expected to move. You wouldn't be considered to have made a pledge to move. But once 20,000 people have signed up, then that's what you're agreeing to move. And they reached that number on February 3rd of this year. It took a long time. I think a lot of the people, if not most of the people, were hearing about it through Free Talk Live and joining it through Free Talk Live. Mark Edge, who is Ian's co-host, I know is working on it all the time. Every year at PorcFest, they get a few more people to sign and a few more people to move. And in fact, in my case, it was going to PorcFest that convinced me to move. Um, Within a day or a week of them reaching their 20,000, that's when they disassociated with Ian Freeman. Now, his positions on whatever you want to talk about, the age of consent or whatever, his positions on those had not changed. They were the same, and they had been well known for years, maybe even more than a decade. So the timing is very well. They got him to they used him to recruit people, and as soon as he had, now they wanted to disassociate from him. Well, Ian Freeman has been a big fixture at PorcFest. He's always there. He hosts a show there every night. And if for no other reason than the fact that he's not going to actively promote it in the way that he normally would, that is probably at least part of the reason there are fewer people here. I haven't listened to the show, so I don't know how he's reacting. It's my understanding in the documents that I've seen. He appreciates a private organization, a freedom of association, all that. But if he's not going to go, I'm sure he's not going to promote attendance more than he would if he was going to go. I'm sure that turned off a lot of people, and it turned off a lot of people at PorcFest. One of the better uh, things at PorcFest was a soapbox where you were allowed to go and speak to the pavilion about whatever you want, and people did lots of different things. But one of the guys who spoke last was a guy named James Babb, who's fairly active in the Free State Project, a very articulate guy, very smart guy, a respectable dude. And he came out and said, look at all the people that we allow to come here, politicians who maybe favor war, soldiers, who hold all kinds of extremely unlibertarian beliefs, and yet they're welcomed here because this is a big tent and we're very welcoming to those people. And then we look at Ian Freeman, and basically this boils down to we don't like his opinion about certain issues that are, to a very least an extent, debatable. And also the fact that they just didn't mind those issues until they had 20,000 signers, and then all of a sudden it became an issue. Uh, Mr. Babb said he was actually not going to go for that reason, that he thought it was, a very, very low of them to do that. And I think there is a certain degree of pettiness. The president of the Free State Project is someone none of you are going to know who they are. I barely know who they are. And Ian Freeman is somebody that many people have heard of. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was a little bit of ego clashing there. Yes, you're the president, but then this radio show host who does his own thing, who's not obligated to act in any way vis-a-vis the Free State Project, is far and away more well-known, more famous, and synonymous, actually, for a lot of people outside the state with the Free State Project, unlike the president, who is essentially a nobody. in terms of the average person out there. I'm not saying they're nobody in real life, but uh, uh, and this guy kind of interestingly said the only reason he came is because his kids insisted. And that's one thing I will say, tons of kids at PorcFest, tons. It seems like the ratio is higher this year than in the past. They have kids events, and this is something that I still find very encouraging. I know I've been a bit of a downer, not as intellectually as stimulating. This whole thing with Ian Freeman, I think, is a blot on them. I think it was a mistake. It turned a lot of people off. I don't think it was justified. Yes, they're within the rights to do it, of course. That doesn't make it the right thing to do, though. Um, but PorcFest is a hugely kid-friendly environment. And what I like is, like, you see kids like 13, 14, 15-year-olds walking around with AR-15s. Uh, and I remember talking to one, again, a kid with an AR-15 who he couldn't have been 15 or more. And he was there last year also with an AR-15. Talked to him. I assumed that he had Free Stater parents because I don't think a 14 or 15-year-old would have the money for an AR-15. And if he's being given one by his parents, it means they're very strong gun. And he goes, yeah, indeed I was. And he was with his friend. And I asked his friend, are you also a Free Stater? And he's like, no, we're friends at school. And I asked, well, do your parents mind that you're going to a festival full of drug using, pro gun toting, anarchists? And he said, well, we didn't tell them that it was this kind of festival. We just said we were going to go camping, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, this kid is going on like a vacation, but he's spending his time with and socializing with a whole bunch of rabidly anti-government zealots, basically. Being exposed to open carry of firearms, both of rifles and of handguns, not to mention of knives and swords, the open use of alcohol and drugs, and that's pretty encouraging, and people do that all the time. You see children there all the time. You see pets. They had dog Olympics, so bring your dogs, and everyone's very well behaved, no problems despite all the drugs and guns and alcohol. There's lots of encouraging things, and if you've never gone, I wouldn't say don't go because of this, because it's still going to be new to you. It's still going to be interesting to you. There's no telling who they're going to get next year. I always think it would be a huge coup if they could get Ron Paul to come, or someone like Tom Woods. Lou Rockwell has never come, but he's been slated to come a few times. So people like that. I think that if they could find better speakers, there would be more of a draw. Because I look at the list today, nobody's going to look at that list of the people who spoke and be like, yeah, I'm definitely going to head up to New Hampshire to see that. Whereas you might do that for for some other speakers. Um, the Ian thing, um, I think I understand it. It's a controversial opinion. Um, you know, uh, when you're talking about sexuality with young people, it violates people's instinctive view of sanctity, that sexuality and children should never mix. And I understand that, and I certainly think that it's ethically very questionable about, especially if you're talking older people with younger people. Younger people with younger people is um, maybe not necessarily good, but not necessarily as bad either. It's tricky to point out a victim, especially if we're talking voluntary. And of course, Ian Freeman and everyone else is talking voluntary consent. But I understand that it looks bad, or it can look bad, or it does look bad for a lot of people. But the Free State Project is going to be viewed as negative by its opponents no matter what. In fact, the fact that they have publicly ostracized Ian Freeman is not going to disassociate him with the Free State Project. The enemies of the Free State Project are still going to say we're crazy, anti-government freeloaders who want to give drugs to kids in elementary school and be pedophiles and whatever else. And they're going to say that whether or not the president of the Free State Project bans Ian Freeman from PorcFest. They're not going to change their mind because you banned him from that. The only thing you can really do is, you know, to debate it, to talk to people on the margins, to realize that some of your enemies are just never going to be convinced, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to sacrifice your own principles and your own interests in order to try and appease people who are never going to be appeased anyway. Does it matter to people on the margins? It might, but people on the margins are going to be more interested in hearing a debate than people who are clearly not on the margins. So yeah, there might be some people who are right on the edge of uh, is it good? Maybe is it bad? Those are the people who would listen to reason. There are people who are categorically going to say it's bad. Well, there's no point in trying to go for those people because no matter what you say, they're not going to change their mind. So, um, yeah, I think that was a mistake for them to ban him. I understand why they did. Uh, I think that he should be unbanned at this point. Just say, okay, all's well, fair enough. You're welcome back. No one's accused him of committing any kind of crime or harming anyone. Or I mean, the statements that the FSP made was a very vague one. Basically, he's made very controversial statements, which is not something to is not grounds to ostracize someone to the extent that he's been ostracized, and it's shot them in the foot. The whole idea that the PorcFest was jumping the shark is not an idea that I came up originally with. Some of the people at Soapbox gave rants basically to this effect, and even deliberately use the iconography of jumping the shark in their things, and I think it's an apt thing. So I hope it's not the end of PorcFest. It's certainly not the end of PorcFest. There'll be many more PorcFests. I talked to people who this was their first one, and they absolutely loved it. One guy I talked to was like, "This is the best time he's ever had in his life." So, that's an honest perspective from a first-time goer. I can't say that that was my reaction to it, and so I'm not going to deny that. Um, you know, uh, I think the level of the speakers is too low, but is it too much to ask that they have speakers that I find interesting and not what most people would find interesting? And I can understand that. But if I just look at the names and the titles of the lectures, I don't think there's any way that people are going to say that what was talked about was anywhere near as interesting as stuff that's been talked about in the past. I found myself never looking at a thing and going, yeah, I really want to see that. There were a couple of things where I thought I might watch that and there might be something worthwhile in that. And indeed, I did watch some of them and there was some worthwhile stuff in there. Mark Warden, who is a Free Stater real estate agent who moved here from Las Vegas, very knowledgeable guy, knows the state very well. Some of the stuff that he talked about, he was talking to people with the idea that they might want to come and buy a house, buy property. He's very he likes to facilitate that. He's in it for money, but like he wants people to come. He offers a lot of free advice to people to try and encourage them to come. The stuff that he had to say was very interesting. There's apparently a lot of Free Staters who don't live in the state but own property in the state. He talked about the number of buildings that are owned by Free Staters, where they're located. Having lived in the state now for a while, it was nice to kind of be familiar with all the areas that he referenced, having visited these towns, largely thanks to Grindr, but whatever. Um, that was fascinating. But then another lecture they had was titled How to Persuade Locals when You're Moving to New Hampshire. And the guy who was giving the lecture is not a guy who's from New Hampshire, not a guy who's moved to New Hampshire or ever lived in New Hampshire, but a guy who was from Philadelphia and had visited New Hampshire twice. And I think just suggested that because people are allowed to ask to give presentations, and the Free State Project will usually say yes if you're not, they'll just put you at a time not many people go. But like this guy had no clue anything about New Hampshire, about the locals, about what it's like to interact with them. And I remember sitting there like, why is this guy giving this presentation? What is what am I learning from this? And it's nothing. And he would even ask, like, well, how many of you have moved? And a couple people raised their hands. He goes, well, then he asked them, why don't you tell me, what you've learned? I'm like, well, wait, you're the lecturer. You should be lecturing us. But, so yeah. Will I go next year? I don't know. That depends on my schedule. I probably won't make a point of, being sure I'll be able to attend no matter what. If I'm free, I probably will. I still suggest it for people who have never gone, and also let's see who they have coming and what they do with the Ian Friedman situation. But definitely a sour note compared to the past, and the fact that it's not bigger, it's not better. Um, but I don't think there's anyone who would say that. So um, anyway, if you went, let me know what you think, what you thought of it, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.